This time on Poll Hub, we are living up to our name with polls, polls, and more polls. We're digging in deep to our new poll with our partners at NPR and PBS NewsHour. There's Biden's approval rating, the stress of COVID, trust in elections. I could go on, but then that's what we're all here to do. Also, some really interesting data from Pew on how polls have done on measuring COVID vaccination rates and what it says about the accuracy of polling in general. Then the coffee debate of the era. That is Lee's fun fact. I'm going to need another cup of Joe just to get through this. I'll be right back. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Lee Miringoff.
We asked a lot of questions in our latest poll with NPR and PBS NewsHour. Not so many questions, a lot of topics we covered in a relatively short amount of time. Let's start with the one that is simple question. It was one question, but it gets a lot of attention, which is Biden's approval rating. We have it in this poll at, for adults anyway, at 45% approve, 46% disapprove, a slight tick up from the lowest numbers that we had recorded for him earlier in the month, very beginning of September. What does it mean? And there are other polls that have him lower and declining still. There are other polls that have him increasing. I mean, what does this all mean?
Well, I think what's most noteworthy about the poll that we just put out is not so much how many people actually approve of Joe Biden, but how many disapprove. And so the last poll that we did, and we put that out right at the start of September, it was right when the U.S. was withdrawing troops from Afghanistan. And we found, like other polls, national polls at that time, that a majority of Americans, 51% in our NPR PBS NewsHour Marist Poll, disapproved of the job that Biden was doing in office. This time around, instead of seeing his approval rating underwater, in other words, in the beginning of the month, his approval rating was 43 and the disapproval was 51. So that was a negative 8 points for him. This time we see Americans dividing. 45% approve, 46% disapprove, and actually somewhat of a movement to unsure rather than on one side or the other. And probably from the White House's perspective, what we probably see here is at least a stall or a plateau in the decline, which all the national polls certainly showed over the summer months until the end of the summer. And some are still showing that he hasn't rebounded.
Yeah, I think if you're going to look at this and say, he used to be underwater, now perhaps he's treading water. In other words,
keep the analogy going.
Yeah, that's right. But what I found interesting in this, the people who strongly disapprove still outnumber those who strongly approve, and that really hasn't.
And that's a pretty significant number. Do you have that in front of you, Lee?
I will momentarily, Barb.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot.
Strongly disapprove. Yeah. Strongly disapproves 37. Yeah. And 17 for strongly approve.
Yeah. So it's more than 2-1 on the downside. So the intensity against Joe Biden is stronger than the love of him. And that's further indicated by this poll. When you talked about a rise in the unsures, what was interesting is that the Democrats are at 9% unsure. Republicans are only at 3% unsure in terms of his approval rating. And similarly, people of color are in the double digits. So in a sense, some of his base is sort of taking in, I hate to say it, a little water with what's been going on, because he certainly has not had, since Afghanistan to what's currently going on in Congress, he's not had a lot of victories. So there's a little bit of a, competency challenge right now for him, a leadership challenge on both those fronts. But the good news for the White House would be that, these Democrats and people of color are probably the easiest group to win back. So in fact, if he does get good results from the congressional negotiations right now, well, we would expect that those unsure would drop and the approval rating at 45 might go back up to a closer to a 50 range, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah, we'll see where that goes.
Yeah.
It is interesting because when we look at the support that Trump had during his presidency, I think one of the things that was very different and kind of startling to a lot of people was not just the fact that he had such strong support among his base, but that he continued to work on his base. In other words, he continued to move policy towards his base. He continued to feed his base. And I think that's a very different strategy than Joe Biden. Joe Biden seems to be more comfortable, looking at the center Democrat rather than the strong progressive Democrat. He's looking at independents who may be leaning Democrat or in other elections, may go in the other direction. So he just seems to be taking a different tact, different approach.
But he doesn't really have a choice, Barb, because Donald Trump's base was Donald Trump. It wasn't just Republicans. Joe Biden's base has an ideological split in it between progressive and moderate Democrats. So in a sense, it's not about Joe Biden like it was about Donald Trump. It's about how do you keep these folks who want very different policy goals within the Democratic tent together. And does the spectrum of Donald Trump and 2022, is that enough to unify that? So in a sense, he's got a tougher deck to dealt with here.
Let's put it in perspective. Donald Trump's high, strongly disapproved number was in the 40s his entire administration. So his
approval rating was
and his approval rating was low. So but we're comparing to kind of the low bar of presidential politics over the course of an entire term.
Well, but I think, what I think I'm comparing though is also just strategy and approach. Trump's strength is certainly that he supported his base supported him, and it was all about that. And I think to a surprise of a lot of people that he didn't move more to the center and extend that base.
Yeah, but that's been the strategies lately in politics. Feed the base, get the turnout, and hope you win. There's another question that we asked, which is always one that tells us a lot, but at the same time doesn't tell us exactly what we want to know. And that's the generic congressional ballot question, where we ask people if, do you going to vote for your Democrat or your Republican in your congressional district? Recognizing that there's a whole bunch of congressional districts. It isn't a national vote. Nonetheless, it does provide us some indication of sort of Democratic sentiment or Republican sentiment. Right now, it's obviously a long time away before the midterm elections. What we found in that was the Democrats were +8, which means right now, all things being equal, which they're not because of redistricting and the separate districts, the Democrats don't look like at this point that they're going to have a horrible time of things in the midterm elections. And I might add that when approval ratings and toss-up questions and all that have been challenged, our congressional ballot question in 2018 and in 2020 was very close to what it turned out nationally in terms of the difference between Democrats and Republicans. So that one question seems to work very well in terms of getting a good valid measure of sentiment.
We'll see where that goes. We only have a minute. I want to get to the other questions we asked in this poll because there's some really interesting stuff on the coronavirus. The stress question, I think, is getting a lot of attention for good reason. We asked if, compared to how people felt at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, it's been 18 months ago now when the lockdown started, to now, do you feel more stressed, less stressed, or about as stressed? And I got to tell you, I was very surprised. 22%, only 20%, 1 in 5 say less stressed. And more than 1 in 3, 36% said more stressed. That surprised me because we've got half of Americans, well, we got, in the 70%, well north of 70% of people over 65 vaccinated, but we've got a majority of Americans vaccinated. And despite the Delta variant and the concerns, it strikes me as notable that a third of people feel more stressed.
And the plurality, 41%, say that they're just as stressed now as they were at the start of the pandemic. So your point, Jay, is really well taken about the fact that, we haven't moved the needle all that much in putting COVID behind us. Certainly, debate over the vaccine, the concern over different variants have kept Americans on edge. Also, I think I'd like to point out is we asked about these vaccine mandates. And with people now going back to work and trying to find that normal, and although we all felt, I think, that we were out of routine, or many of us felt we were out of routine during the pandemic, we had figured out some kind of, our non-routine was a routine, because now as we're all venturing back to back to work and back to a more normal state, there's still a lot of stress and a lot of concern. And I almost feel like we have this national disorientation. We did ask some questions about the vaccine. Did you want to jump in with those, Lee?
Well, I was going to just quickly say that that what I thought about the stress factor, the vaccine, first of all, people are more comfortable having, people, healthcare workers should be getting a vaccine. And if you're a federal contractor, that's probably not as strong on the mandate, although it still was 51%. But I'd like to point out that on the stress, and we're going to move on to a related topic in a second, the folks who are more stressed by party are Republicans. They're Trump voters, not Biden voters, and they're rural residents. So what's happened is there's a huge difference right now between what was a national epidemic and now it's becoming much more a regional one, where the hospital troubles and the deaths are occurring in the red areas in the country who were very slow to get the vaccine. So there's a big relationship between the two. And now those folks are saying, hey, we got a little bit more of a problem here than we thought. And that's because the crisis there is still very, very severe. And that anybody want to segue into the next topic, because it couldn't come in, but Barb, I'll let you do the segue.
Well, thanks, Lee.
This is
Thanks.
perfect segue.
Well, sure, because polls, as we know, are estimates and give us certainly a quicker and less expensive way of finding out what people think than if we had to talk to everybody, particularly when we're looking at large geographic areas like the nation. But because they're estimates, we don't always have a lot of ways of knowing whether polls are correct. In other words, making them accountable. What is the real number? We certainly have the census where the federal government tries to count everybody every 10 years. But besides that, we normally just have elections. Polls, say who's going to win and by how much. And then we see on election day whether that was accurate or not. Well, COVID gave us another opportunity. And the Pew Research Center actually examined the results of 98 polls from 19 different organizations, including us. They started at the end of 2020 and went through June of this year. And then they compared those numbers to the actual counts from the CDC, the actual data on vaccination rates. And what Pew found is that national polls were actually pretty accurate. Actually within 2.8 percentage points. So does this give pollsters more hope, the public more confidence? What are your thoughts, guys?
Well, I certainly felt that. And I thought, keep in mind, there's a few asterisks that have to be raised here. And one is certainly that when you do a poll of people who are in the process of getting vaccinated, and your poll goes, let's say, for 5 or 6 days, the number of vaccinated is going to change during that period. So that accounts for some of the discrepancy in the numbers. They took that into consideration in terms of the overs and the unders, and when they averaged it out, it came in even more precise, which I thought was interesting. Election polls, you're really measuring future behavior, likely voters. This is a non-election poll, and as a result, it's really looking at things people have done. And so that may make it a little bit easier. But having said those two kind of like caveats, asterisks, whatever you want to call them, these numbers really were very telling. And it showed that, a very, very precise estimate in the national polls when, we haven't just been getting that as much in elections. So there's no story now, except for this Pew Research. Polls are right when it comes to measuring the vaccine.
Yeah, where's the headlines on that, right?
Yeah,
Who's doing those stories?
So
go ahead.
So I was just going to say, reports of the death of polling seems to have been really premature or wrong, because these are very precise numbers.
Yeah, and they looked. I think we ought to mention they looked at 98 polls from 19 organizations, including Marist, over this period of time from late December 2020 to June 30th. So this isn't. They looked at a couple of polls. This was a really thorough analysis. There is one thing that strikes me where this is similar to election polls. You talked about election polls being really looking at what future behavior would be. And so there is some explanation for problems with polls in that, things can happen. Candidates can show up. There can be problems. There can be releases of, FBI news conferences, things like that can change things. This actually has some of that too, in that the CDC data is reported by the states to the CDC of vaccinations, and it can lag, and it's different in different states. And so where there is also error on the part of the pollsters in did you get vaccinated or not, or are you going to, and that takes place over a period of days. There's a field time. There's also this error possible with the CDC data in terms of trying to compare them and be apples to apples. Even with all of those caveats, though, this plus 0.3% error when you do the over and under is remarkable. I mean, it's really, truly remarkable. And I think it does put to rest some of this notion that polling on a national scale, that polling is broken. On a national scale, I think we've seen both in national numbers and in this, that it's not broken. It's not broken. There may be issues, but it's not broken.
I also went back because when I saw the 2.8 and I went through the Pew's methodology, and you're right, Jay, to point out that this wasn't just a haphazard look at a couple of polls. This was a pretty rigorous assessment of how the polls were measuring vaccination rates. But I also thought, gosh, that 2.8 sounds very familiar. And so when I looked back at the last few elections, what we did see now, certainly there was a large error in 2020 for national polls, which we've discussed. It was 4.5. But I went back to 2016. It was 2.2 for the national election. Now, granted, the result itself was surprising, but it's not because the national polls weren't telling the story. And I think one of the interesting things here about looking at something like COVID is there's actually a statistic, there's a statistical margin of error, but there's not an editorial margin of error like there is in elections. So when we're looking at elections, even if you're off by a little bit, if you've got the wrong winner, it sure doesn't feel good.
And you can be off by quite a bit as long as you have the right winner, because then people don't, do the polls are wrong story. So really, yeah. But what I found in here, Barb. Well, once you finish your point, then I'll jump in.
Well, no, it was just part of my research over time, and pollsters have been actually clocking how well they've been doing since 1936. And for those who, are history buffs, know that that was a pretty tough year for pollsters, and one that went into the history books of things not to do.
Like subscribe to Literary Digest for polls.
Right. And be careful who you poll. But I thought it was very interesting that over time, since 1936, the average error for all polling at the national level of presidential elections is 4.4. So plus or minus 4.4 percentage points. So 2020 was actually at the average, not an outlier. Certainly, polling has been much more accurate over time. The 2021 was an outlier in the sense that there hadn't been that wide an error for quite a number of decades. But then also the other thing I found was until 1952, polls consistently overstated Republicans. And it wasn't actually until the 1960s that they started overstating Democrats. And it's been, this 60 years that we have seen more of an overstatement of Democrats. So also not a new phenomenon. I know that didn't have to do with COVID, but I thought those were interesting. I thought those were interesting facts.
Well, let me segue back into COVID for one sec, and that is that we heard in the last elections, the two last presidential elections, the Trump factor, that has thrown it off in terms of who people are talking and all that. Well, in the red states, in this particular poll on vaccines, the red states are showing up with people just like the blue states. So there wasn't this non-differential response or differential non-response, rather. There was a notion here. The Trump people are talking to pollsters when it comes to vaccines, at least, and why shouldn't they? So anyway.
But you have another debate and another election of sorts as part of your fun factly.
Yeah, well, our producer Ashley Marcinek, we've been telling her because we tend to ignore her signals, but she's waving right now a cup of coffee at me, and that probably has something to do with my fun fact, which is, in fact, according to a survey which was done by the Public Religion Research Institute on race, class, and culture in 2012. Would you prefer Dunkin Donuts to shop at or Starbucks? And the answer is, I thought, somewhat surprising. Dunkin Donuts by 15%, 48 to 33 over
15
Starbucks.
points.
15 points. I'm sorry. And I found that surprising. I would prefer to be a Dunkin Donut person myself, but I'm not usually in the larger group of Americans. Do you find this surprising, this result, or is this sort of what you expected?
I'm not a coffee drinker, as you guys know, but certainly the treats are much more enticing at Dunkin Donuts than they are at Starbucks. So I would be a Dunkin person, but I think they were talking coffee here.
I do think, but I do think it's worth pointing out. The question is, would you prefer to shop at Dunkin Donuts or Starbucks?
Yeah.
So it's not, as much as we're talking about coffee, it's not necessarily, I think the implication is it's about coffee, but it may not be about coffee. But let's go around the horn real quick. Ashley, let's start with you. Dunkin or Starbucks? You can hold up your Starbucks cup as you tell us.
Surprisingly, that I am a Dunkin Donuts gal. I had one. I'm from Connecticut. There are Dunkin Donuts everywhere, and there's one that was walking distance from my house. So my friends and I would always go there because I'm from a small town. There's only like 3 places to go. So I love a good Dunkin Donuts.
Did you say three places or 30?
3. No, 3. It's
3.
like a bank, a nail salon, and then like a Dunkin Donuts.
Well, that covers it. I mean, what more do you need in life?
Where do you get your car gas?
So Marcello, what about you?
I'm in it for the donuts, so I'm Dunkin all the way.
Casey?
See, I'm split too there because I'm Dunkin Donuts for food other than the pumpkin scone at Starbucks. The Dunkin Donuts does the food better, but Starbucks, I like their coffee better.
Yeah. And Mr. DeDapper, I think I know where you're going on this.
Well, so yeah, but what I'm going to go is that I always seek out, and this is going to sound so precious, I always seek out local coffee places because same way I seek out a local bookstore back in the days when there were bookstores, as opposed to the big chains, to try and support local folks. So here, when I'm near campus, I will go. There's a new place that's nearby here that opened in a little infill urban complex. There's a place down by the train station I'll drive over to. There's a place up in Hyde Park that I'll drive to. But we do have coffee in the office. So I guess I'm a Keurig guy, actually.
but if forced, I mean, we're not letting you away. You go Starbucks over Dunkin Donuts.
I prefer, because I drink iced coffee, and the Dunkin Donuts iced coffee is fine, but it's better at Starbucks because they do a lighter roast.
And I get the last word about my fun fact, I guess, and that is, I also interpret it as, do I want a chocolate frosted donut or a cup of coffee at Starbucks? And there's no comparison there. So I think that there was a little bit of confusion. What am I shopping at exactly when I go to Dunkin Donuts, and what am I shopping at when I go to Starbucks? Question wording is important. And we're going to see you all next week to discuss, whatever's going on then.
that'll do it for Poll Hub this week. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Ashley Marcinek and Marcello Bettman.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other like-minded listeners find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have any questions, tweet them at us at Marist Poll. Finally, however, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.